Today on Amaranth Bay, we're going to be working in this angled part of the grid in the east end, building a car-centric commercial and office district that's sandwiched between the freeway and Main Street. We're going to start with this supermarket that fills up an entire block all on its own, including its parking lot, of course, taking inspiration from this super one in Duluth. Now, there was a distinct lack of Midwest-specific supermarkets on the workshop, so I went ahead and picked an asset that looked good and fit into the space available, which ended up being this Food Lion. Now, I'm sure that Food Lion is a real chain that exists somewhere, but I have to say that I've never actually seen one in real life, so for me, it still kind of occupies this space as like a stand-in for the kind of regional chain that you'd find in Minnesota, like Super One or Cub or something like that. The big challenge of this build, not surprisingly, is the slope. So to solve that, I'm going to try adjusting things in steps so that no one elevation change is too big. So that means raising up the frontage road, having the parking lot just slightly sloped so that the sharpened nodes don't look terrible, and trying to give some breathing room to all these networks so that changes in elevation aren't too visible. Despite all of that, there is still this huge gap at the bottom of the lot, but I think it's still a reasonable enough height to just add in a retaining wall, which we'll do in a moment. First, we just have to plop down the parking spots, and then clean up some of the uglier nodes in these transitional areas. Up here at the top of the parking lot, I'm going to add a very short retaining wall because there is a slight change in heights here, although it might be kind of hard to see at this angle. And then down below, I'm going to use IMT to build this taller retaining wall. These big parking lot road networks seem to have some wizardry going on behind the scenes because when you IMT a sharpened corner of these assets, it still has a rounded line that goes around it instead of a sharp corner, which normally is not a problem, but in this case it means I have to manually drag in this network to fill in the corner of the retaining wall. Much like the store in Duluth, I wanted to leave just enough room around back for a semi to back up to the loading bay, which I think is kind of a nice change of pace from the usual sort of suburban supermarket where they kind of tuck the loading area away from view on a dedicated road network around back. Another thing that I wanted to steal from the inspiration was that the back of the store has a kind of off-white painted brick facade, while the front of the store is just the plain exposed brick. I'm not sure if there's some practical implication for this, but I just think it looks cool, so I'm going to try to achieve that by sizing these painted brick walls up and then clipping them into the asset. Because this side road is quite sloped, I had to try to account for that in the loading area. So we have this supplemental parking lot over to the side, and I just use a terraforming road to get a nice gentle slope that goes all the way down from Main Street to the foundation of the main asset. And then beyond that, I flattened out the rest using this pavement road and some ploppable pavement, along with a small extension of the retaining wall. Of course, the flat part then has this really awkward gap where the side road continues sloping down and the loading area levels out. So I did something that I normally would not be bothered to do, which is creating a ramp between the two slopes using a PO version of this ploppable pavement. I figured in this cramped area, it would be a lot easier just to do it manually instead of trying to figure it out with networks or IMT or something like that. I didn't want to over detail this area, so to finish it off, I just covered up the grass with this concrete paver decal, which I think represents the sort of sloped driveway that you see in this situation where you have a drive or some sort of car accessible area right next to the road. I also dirtied up the pavement and added some wall lights, which are actually just lampposts clipped into the wall because it's way easier to do it that way than trying to find the correct elevation with these tiny wall-mounted lights. The joy of fiddly slope detailing is going to continue around front. I wanted to extend this built-in cement walkway system all the way up to the road, and because these assets are all by King Leno, I can just use his matching cement props to do that. They're terrain conforming, which is generally useful for building on a slope, but it's not perfect because we also have a crossways slope, which means that the foundation of the building does get exposed a little bit here. I didn't use the cement props for this pathway that goes across the parking lot because the grass median in the middle here is actually higher than the props, and since they're terrain conforming, I can't raise them up. But I don't think that everything needs to match perfectly, so I think it looks good enough as is. Over here, the slope gets even more fun. I took another copy of this store just to use the brick texture as a retaining wall that's going to cover up the exposed foundation of the building. And then I used 2 more copies to make a ramp over here that goes between the 2 heights of walkways. Of course, an elevated walkway also requires a fence to mitigate any elevation-related nonsense, so I'm going to add in that. Turning this one into a PO group so that I can distort the entire thing and get a nice smooth slope, which is one of my favorite slope detailing techniques at the moment. It looked a bit weird to have the roof texture also be the floor texture for the ramp, so I came back and fit a PO pavement piece on top so that it could accept decals, and then I put down the matching cement decals so that everything looks nice and cohesive. Although I figured that it would be a shame to do all this detailing and make it look cohesive and not have anyone use it, so I also drew out a pedestrian path along the route and then upgraded to the invisible version, so hopefully people will use that to access the store. While a lot of the areas of the East End have seen relatively fast and cohesive periods of development, like the massive pre-war houses and the big hospital campus, I wanted this commercial district to feel like it's developed in a more patchwork manner over time. So you have more recent businesses like the supermarket we just built that fill up an entire block and have big dedicated parking lots, and everything's kind of oriented around the car-centricness of it. And then you have somewhat older businesses that have been fit into smaller properties among the pre-existing development. Of course, we'll also have a couple examples of the original architecture as well, scattered around this area, much like the ones from last episode, but we'll get to those in a bit. For now, I wanted to focus on that middle category, starting with this strip mall. I wanted to experiment with a few different factors to try to get that patchwork look and kind of tell the historical development story of this area. So first, there's the orientation. So this mall faces Main Street, which I think makes it feel like it caters to pedestrians and transit riders as much as cars. Whereas with the bigger buildings, they're positioned around basically whatever orientation of parking lot maximizes the number of parking spots. So I think that from above, visually speaking, that's going to help you pick out the newer versus the older lots. So these middle era lots are still car-centric. They have big dedicated parking lots, but they're not quite to the same degree as the bigger lots. Then, of course, there's the parking lot itself. With this mall, it's basically just a couple lines of parking spots crammed up against the road, while the more modern ones have these massive dedicated lots. I think it probably would have driven the point home a little better to just have a single row of parking spots right off the road. I'm sure you know the type of lot that I'm talking about. But I think it works okay as is. And the texture is also important. So as usual in my builds, I'm going to try to switch up between different shades of pavement and asphalt for different lots. Finally, there is the most obvious factor, which is the size of the lots. These kind of middle era buildings are usually going to maintain the alley system that cuts our blocks in half. So with the strip mall, you can imagine how there once were either pre-war houses or maybe wall-to-wall shops, like the ones you find in downtown here. And then in this case, they bought up the entire half block and bulldozed whatever remained there and then built their buildings here. But in other cases, like the other half of this same block, they only bought up 1 or 2 adjacent lots, so you get a wider variety of self-contained developments. Then, of course, with the more modern era ones, like the supermarket, they're just going to bulldoze the entire block, including the alley, and completely reshape the use of space. I don't know if any of that actually reflects how historical development has happened in real life, let alone in Duluth in particular, but it's really just the story that I had in my head so that I could try to easily figure out what to put in each block, and hopefully have it evoke some kind of story about the history of the development of Amaranth Bay. I had been eyeing this particular block for quite a while due to its prominent location next to the Cap Park on top of the freeway, and also being at the end of the frontage road. Eventually, I decided against building a big commercial development and instead chose a mid-rise apartment tower, which to me would feel a bit more welcoming and relaxing for people visiting the park. I'm thinking that maybe at some point in the city's past, there would have been a big historic building here, kind of like the community center from last episode. Except in this case, it became derelict and was eventually demolished around the time the city was trying to re-densify on the fringes of downtown with all the sorts of modern infill that we put down previously in these sorts of neighborhoods. So this lot was picked up in that rush of apartment building for a big new complex for the same reason that I mentioned before, to fit in better near the park, but also to try to bring some population to an area that's mostly zoned for business and just try to generally increase the mixed-use potential for this side of town. Because of the curved road here, there was this little awkward spot, and instead of trying something elegant that makes efficient use of the space, or something simple like just using it for landscaping, I thought it would be funny to have one of those historic remnants that I talked about before, except in this case it's nothing special, just a tiny little shop that apparently is so good at making sheet metal and furnaces that being in this awkward spot hasn't hurt their business at all after like 150 years. I feel like it's pretty common to see modern office parks pop up next to freeways, especially the farther you get from a downtown, the more you're going to see this. So next up, I wanted to take inspiration from this pair of buildings in Duluth, which I believe mostly house medical offices, although in our case, they're just going to be generic offices. And you know what that means. At this point, I had gotten a little bit tired of making parking lots, so I just ended up using the classic parking lot roads, which are a bit harder to customize than some of the other options, but they're really easy to put down. And at the end of the day, there's nothing that a little bit of hand detailing can't fix up to look nice. Is that the word that I'm looking for? Nice? Around back, there was a bit of an exposed foundation due to the slope. We have a pretty extreme slope here next to the freeway, and I couldn't help but cover that up with a slightly nicer looking textured wall. While I was here, I also copied a loading area that I saw in the inspiration building because I felt like this complex needed something to kind of just make it a little bit, something to make it look a little bit more unique and interesting. Oh, and just in case you, for some reason, had the thought that there weren't enough parking spots up top, the mirrored building got the exact same treatment and definitely to the same level of detail and not sloppily done at all. You know, I've made enough videos at this point that sometimes I can feel the pace of the video starting to drag even while I'm recording the build. So at this point, I realized that it would be a good time for kind of seems like an abrupt transition to have office blocks and supermarkets fit into the grid right next to these old pre-war homes, but that's pretty much how it is in Duluth, and I do think that it speaks to the way this area has gradually developed over time. Also, I just think it looks pretty cool from above. So at some point in the future, we're going to use this little area of houses as a jumping off point to start adding in the eastern suburbs of the city, or at least I assume we're going to do that. I don't have any specific plans at the moment. For now, it'll just be here kind of as a signal that this is where the city starts transitioning away from more urban development into more suburban development. With that being said, I wanted to head over to the other side of Main Street to finish off the build with these 4 blocks, starting over here across from the community center and working our way east. First, we have an example of the more modern class of buildings that I talked about before, which is this extremely inaccurately named pharmacy chain. Although the business has still bought up multiple properties and eliminated the alleyway like the supermarket did, it's a little bit different because it only takes up the short half of the block, which I think is kind of an interesting variation because it still leaves the other half available for older developments. So you get that contrast of the newer and older types of development right next to each other, which just makes them visually more apparent. The slope in this area is quite steep, so I wanted to keep the parking lot as straightforward as possible to build, because often the big parking lot road pack can be a little bit challenging to build with on a slope like this. So I made it using these pavement roads and then these parking lot buildings, both of which are really easy to work with on slope terrain. And doing it that way also gives it the look that they basically just slathered the ground in pavement rather than worrying about landscaping or foliage or retaining walls or anything else like that that could make it look a little bit more nice and inviting. Anyway, it was a bit difficult to detail the drive-through that is built into this asset around the side because some of the building is clipped down into the slope. So I figured that the best way to go about this was to make everything look purposeful. So I added a curb underneath the pillars, which helps define the drive-through lane and just generally helps to blend everything together into the terrain and make it look intentional. I also added in a door prop to represent the window, because that makes sense, and a couple of cars waiting at the drive-through as well, and they will continue to wait there until the end of the series, presumably. But I think that in the end, it's hard to even tell that half the building is sunk down into the ground because of these details. This hardware store echoes the layout of the inaccurately named pharmacy chain, but instead of having its store up front against the road, it is set back behind a big parking lot, which I feel like is kind of justified given the sorts of things that people need to haul out of a hardware store. But anyway, that orientation is also going to play into the patchwork look that I brought up before. I think if you had a bunch of these big chains with big parking lots all laid out in the exact same way, within the same vicinity of each other, it would feel way too much like the kind of massive planned shopping centers that you see out in the suburbs. And I'm sure we will have an area like that at some point in the future, but today is not that point in the future, obviously. Here's one of the callbacks to the last episode that I mentioned before. In this case, it is an adorable small building that gets a whole corner lot to itself. I have absolutely no idea what goes on in this building in the modern day or how it's managed to survive the onslaught of parking lots around it, but I had to sneak this asset in somewhere because it is just too cute. If you're curious, this is the Skridskapa Pavillongen, nailed it, by Norland Martin, which I will link down in the description along with any other assets that I mentioned by name in the description. I mean, no matter what goes on here, it has probably seen better days given the condition of the yard out back, but maybe someday it'll get cleaned up and turned into a salon or a wine bar or something like that. It seems like the sort of business that would take over in there. I don't know why. In the next block over, I thought it would be interesting to have a couple industrial remnants. I don't know if it really makes sense given that historically this neighborhood was supposed to have been pretty wealthy and exclusive, but maybe these buildings were snuck in sometime between the decline of the original wealth of the neighborhood and the post-war boom of middle-class housing and services that came later. I clipped a commercial and residential block to represent that it's recently been converted into a mixed-use building, so you would have stores on the first floor and then lofts in the 2 floors above. Up the hill, there's a more modern-looking garage, which is still operating as a mechanic. It might seem funny given that there are no other industrial buildings still operating in the vicinity, but I feel like mechanics can kind of fit into either a industrial or commercial context, so in this case, it'll fit right into our commercial area, much to the joy of its neighbors taking up the rest of the block, I'm sure. In contrast to the historic industrial architecture across the street is Taco Bell, which I don't think really needs any further comment. Finally, to finish off the build, I wanted to build this thing that I stumbled across in Duluth, which is this pair of buildings where you have what looks like a historic building on the corner attached to one of these random colored square facade buildings that seem to be so popular around this burg. Anyway, I thought that it looked pretty cool, so I wanted to do my rendition as an apartment building that is part historic, part modern. So we have the same kind of setup with the historic one on the corner and then the modern attachment over here. And of course, they have a dedicated parking lot around back off the alley. And I think all of that just kind of sums up the sorts of development that we've done in this video pretty nicely. If you're wondering about things like the streetcar or bus lines, those are going to be coming next episode, assuming everything goes to plan like it always does, along with an interchange to allow access to this area from the freeway, among many, many other things. So I hope to see you then. Thank you to my channel members, with a special shout out to my $5 tier members, Fainted, New, Peter J, and Victor Sellin. And thank you for watching. See ya.
Burning through the city of lights. You're the sunshine on my mind.